So I hope that you're doing great today. Today's a very important day. It's as everyone surely knows. And I've literally spent my entire adult life in service to my nation, the protection of people's right uh to vote, free speech, and pursue the political process. And so I am very appreciative of the time that it takes for you. Hopefully, you've already voted to participate in this election and continue to defend democracy. With that, let's start. So, if you have any questions, please hold them till the end. You can go ahead and insert your question into the section, if you will, within the comments, and we will pick them up at the end. And I'm willing to stay as long as it takes to get your questions answered. Okay, so we're going to go as really deep, folks. And the reason why is because I want this to be definitive. I want you to understand with clarity and certainty why these requirements are what they are. Okay. So the DoD recently passed, as everyone should know, the CUI final rule, or the CMMC final rule rather, and then the CUI FAR rule, which we expect to be released any day now, will have a significant impact on the entire federal ecosystem. But suffice to say, though, that the DoD takes this very seriously, and they are taking, and I am grateful as having formerly served with a DoD senior civilian. I'm very grateful that they are taking it seriously, and with that includes your responsibilities and understanding that there is no one coming to save you. We are responsible for protecting this technical information relative to the performance of our DoD manufacturing contracts and similar contracts, and to prevent it from being stolen by the adversaries who wish to seek to destroy us. And I'm not going to mince words about that. That this is the hands down the greatest existential threat that we've ever faced. And if we don't do anything about it, we are done for as a nation. And I have been uniquely gifted to be as relentless as possible. That's the Ranger in me, to ensure that I contribute my very best in order to ensure that that does not happen. Part of that is you doing the work. Okay. You cannot rely on a consultant. You cannot rely on your friend. You cannot rely on your neighbor. You cannot rely on your coworkers. You must do your homework to understand these requirements in order to protect this information, because these warfighting capabilities are essential to the survival of our nation. So the primary references that we're going to talk about today are 32 CFR. It was yes, the marking, but it's really about 32 CFR in general. Okay, U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. Now there's also the 32 CFR Part 170, right? The 2002 is focused entirely on the CUI program itself. The Part 170 is about the CMC program rule, and they are intertwined, as you might imagine. The CR registry gives us specific guidance in understanding what CUI categories are applicable to our performance of our work. Okay, not every CUI category is applicable to the performance of our work, so we have to educate ourselves to what's in the CR registry and what's specifically applicable to the defense industrial base. Yes, but of course the DoD supply chain at large. Most of the time, of course, that is controlled technical information, export controlled information within the manufacturing segment. We also have to understand what the CUI notices require of us. Why is that true? Because we must first always look to the narrow guidance to understand our requirements at the federal level, and then we have to understand DoD policy and how it applies to us. And if you do not believe me, then that's perfectly fine. I will show you over and over and over again where the things that I'm saying are true. Okay. It's important that you realize that I'm going to spend time ripping off some band-aids. And it may take your breath away for a second when you realize that you may not have been meeting the requirements as you understand them. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that you understand them so you can meet them. So that includes the application of the DoD instructions and DoD guidance required to or provided to us authoritative guidance within the cybersecurity FAQ and the DoD procurement toolbox, and also the brand new CMMC FAQ. So we're going to take these references and apply them to understand what these requirements are and how to meet them. Okay. So to mince no words about it, okay, the CMC model verifies the compliance. This comes straight out of the rule, folks, with DoD cybersecurity protection standards for defense contractors and subcontractors. So that includes you, Tier 17, okay? And it is designed to protect sensitive, unclassified information, federal contract information and CUI that is shared by the department with its contractors and subcontractors, and when it's developed by the contractor in the course of the performance of the work, even when it's not shared. Okay. So you are responsible for the CUI that you receive in the performance of your work. You're responsible for the CUI that you develop in the performance of your work, even if you don't share that CUI. Okay. And so that's where you're going to find news, even though that is not news. Everything that I'm going to tell you has been already required of you by the DoD since December 31st of 2017. There's nothing new under the sun. I'm just repackaging it and show you out of the CMC rule how it is connected. So the CMC final rule, this is a quotation directly out of the rule, does not impact or supersede 32 CFR 2002 or make exceptions for the categories of CUI or the designating agency for the CUI. Designating agency is the DoD. Okay, where we are authorized holders in the performance of our work. We have the authority as an authorized holder to designate CUI, but the DoD is responsible for the designating agency for the CUI relative to the performance of the work, and I'll show you where that's true. So our responsibility is to understand that the 32 CFR does not supersede the 32 CFR 2002. That the CUI program is the guiding the CUI program provides the guidance for the protection of CUI. The CMC program itself, underneath the 32 CFR Part 170 rule, actually does the protecting in its that it's validating whether or not the requirements have been met. Okay, so that's the relationship. Okay, so when we look to as you will see that the DoD has reinforced over and over and over again in its response to public comments, that the 32 CFR does not establish anything new for 32 CFR Part 170, the CMC final rule, does not establish anything new relative to CUI or the CUI program or DoD policy relative to CUI. It only enforces those requirements through its means of validation through third-party certification. All right. So if that doesn't make sense to you, it's very important that we talk about that and that you have a question about that, because that's the cornerstone of everything that I'm going to tell you. All right. When we look at the response to public comments, it's important now that you understand the context of what the DoD said in relationship to the questions and the comments that people asked. So in the 32 CFR Part 170 rule, I'm sorry, that's a typo. On the Part 170 rule, the 22 comments requested the government to provide more guidance, preferably within RFPs or contracts, or better to better identify what is considered to be CUI for the contract and how it should be appropriately marked. One comment specifically noted a need for the contractual instructions on whether or not the data created in the performance of the contract rises to the level of CUI. Another person asked when does information created or possessed by a contractor become CUI? One comment asked whether digital or physical items derived from CUI are treated as CUI. And another asked whether specific information qualifies as CUI for OT or IoT assets. Another comment asked whether or not FCI, federal contract information, or CUI created or provided under a non-DoD agency contract, but when it's also used in support of the DoD contract, would be subject to the applicable CMC level requirement. Now, the response from the DoD is telling, and I'm going to explain to you why it is so important that you understand why they replied what they did. Their response is that neither the CUI program established in Executive Order 13556, which is the deadline for that was in December 31st of 2017, nor the safeguarding requirements codified in its implementing directives are changed by the virtue of the compliance assessment framework established by the 32 CFR final rule. Okay? What they're telling you there is that there are no changes. All the questions that you need to know, have already been provided for you. The answers have already provided for you in existing documentation, and they in fact have. But there's a rampant misunderstanding of these requirements, and I'll try to help bring clarity and certainty to your understanding of these requirements. CMC requirements apply to prime contractors and subcontractors throughout the supply chain at all tiers that will process, store, transmit any FCI or CUI on contractor informations in the performance of the DoD contract or subcontract, irrespective of the origin of the information. Meaning that it doesn't matter if the DoD provided you that information, or the prime contractor provided you that information, or you developed that information in performance of the contract and then pass that information down to your tier supplier. What's important is that the information qualifies as CUI, and we're going to talk about that explicitly. Okay. So the executive branch, and the response continues, says that the executive branch's CUI program is codified in 32 CFR Part 2002 and establishes for the policy for designating, handling, and decontrolling information that qualifies as CUI. So the really important question is what information qualifies as CUI? That's what you should be asking yourself. And that is essential to understanding how to meet the requirements in identifying CUI, how to meet the requirements in marking CUI, and then how to meet the requirements in safeguarding CUI within the CMC program. So the definition of CUI and the general requirements for safeguarding are included within the 32 CFR 2002. So there's nothing new here. And it explains to you how to safeguard that information relative to accessing and sharing that information in 2002-14, respectively. All right. It provides you the guidance that you also have to safeguard the information using the NIST 800-171, which is, again, the cornerstone of the 32 CFR Part 170, the CMC model itself. So that is already an existing requirement. They've already established this by policy. And what's unfortunately, what's rampantly misunderstood is how to understand and apply that policy. So that is what we're going to decrypt to you. And this is what I've been doing, folks, for the past almost 5 years now, okay? There is nothing new that I'm telling you in this broadcast that I haven't said over the last 5 years. There's nothing new. It is all directly applicable, and we're going to help decrypt that for you. So at the time of award, the DoD goes on and says the DoD may have no visibility, which they don't. They do not manage the CUI in 25 tiers of tier suppliers. Whether or not the awardee will choose to further disseminate DoD CUI, meaning that from the prime contractor down to the next tier, down to the next tier, down to the next tier, or whether or not that tier subcontractor developed CUI in the performance of their work and then shared it. So the DFARS contract clause, DFARS 252, 204, 7012, and the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7021, which is the CMC requirement, require the prime contractor to flow the information security requirement down to any subcontractor, which the CUI will be shared. Okay. So if you're doing work in performance of the DoD contract, the information qualifies as CUI, the technical specifications that are shared to you in order to perform the work, they become CUI. And that information must be protected and safeguarding according to the 32 CFR Part 170 rule, the CMC model. All right. So the decisions between the prime contractor and the subcontractors, and the subcontractor and the subcontractor, and the subcontractor and the subcontractor are entirely the responsibility of those that perform the contract. That's the burden. The burden can be lessened if there's an appropriate relationship between what information qualifies as CUI and what information is needed for the organization or the outside vendor or the outside processor, that what information do they require to actually perform the work. You lessen the burden by giving them less information or the information that they need to actually perform the work that qualifies as CUI instead of giving them everything. Okay. So there's another important response that I want to cover. The marking requirements underneath the 32 CFR Part 170 response to public comments. Okay. So 23 comments expressed concern with or requested clarification regarding CUI marking. 12 comments specifically noted concern with CUI markings being applied to too many documents, which is very unlikely, in part because CUI was an ambiguous concept, which it is not. They requested the DoD encourage personnel to mark documents as CUI only when appropriate and provide better guidance for managing flow down clauses. Well, that's true, and that's a great comment. Another comment noted that many small businesses are currently subject to the NIST 800-171 requirements through the DFARS contract clause and cannot say with certainty that they have CUI in their possession. That is not the fault of the DoD. That is a fault of the misunderstanding of the requirements. And I wish that weren't true. It is true. And I will explain to you with clarity and conciseness why that is true and consistent with the standard. So the response from the DoD is that the CMC program will not provide CUI guidance materials. Why? Because they've already been provided. It's outside the scope of the CMC rule. It's not relevant. The rule requires you to protect CUI. It doesn't. The 32 CFR Part 170 rule doesn't require you it requires you to understand how to protect CUI, or you shouldn't be performing the work. That is the hard part, folks. So we need some tough love here. We need to assume accountability and responsibility for our own destiny here. And if we don't, right, we're going to mishandle CUI. We are not going to market properly, and we are going to allow our enemies access to that information in order to compromise us and our weapon systems and place our lives at risk, our families' lives at risk, and certainly our warfighters at risk. Now, the DoD, within the response to public comments, appropriately refers them back to the 32 CFR, and also guides them the fact that the DoD's role as data owner is documented in the CUI program. It's already telling you in the implementing of the policies and the requirements of the 32 CFR Part 202. And the DoD instruction already assigns your responsibilities to you. Okay? Now, is the DoD instruction 5248 well written? No. It is a terribly written document. In fact, it's embarrassing me as a former DoD senior civilian. But that's not relevant. What is relevant is that we have the responsibility to understand it. And I will try to help you navigate through those requirements. The DoD 5248 as the cornerstone control document for policy guidance on CUI, tells you what your responsibilities are. The authorized holder of a document or material is responsible for determining, at the time of creation, this is the process called designation, whether the information in a document or in a material falls into a CUI category. That is your responsibility as an authorized holder, both as an individual and as an organization in the performance of your contract. If so, the authorized holder is responsible for applying CUI markings and designating instructions accordingly. Okay, DoD Manual 5200.01 outlines DoD Information Security Program, includes Volume 2, Marking of Information. Now, there are some supplemental documents that the DoD should be providing, but that is not necessarily required in order to properly mark CUI and understand what information qualifies as CUI. It's in addition to. Okay. And oftentimes when we have a tiered relationship between the prime contractor and 12 tiers below the prime contractor, we don't ever see those documents. But that doesn't mean that our responsibilities are any less. They are. We have the responsibility to protect the information, to know which information qualifies as CUI, and to mark the information and safeguard it accordingly, according to the marking requirements in the CMC rule itself. Okay. It's very clear. And I will show you how we will apply this with consistency and with certainty on how it aligns to DoD policy as it is right now in order to meet the CMC requirements, in order to ensure that you certify and you continue to do great work in contribution to the DoD. So let's boil this down. Now we've established that foundation, and there's no ambiguity about that. There's no uncertainty. People who have told you that you do not mark CUI do not understand the requirements, and you should run from them. Okay? It has been that guidance has been the exact guidance that has been communicated through DoD policy, through the DoD cybersecurity FAQ, through other FAQs, including the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency FAQ, for the last 4 years. Okay, so people who have told you that people have told you that you do not mark CUI do not understand the requirements. It is clear, it is explicit, and the CMC rule explicitly states that with little ambiguity. Okay, so with that, let's focus on the NIST 800-171 requirements. So what do we have to do in identifying and marking CUI? Well, we got to protect it. How can we protect it if we don't know what it is? So we have the responsibility to protect CUI, but we have to identify it as CUI first. And so remember that we have to understand our responsibilities. That's number one, because we shouldn't accept contracts that we don't understand the responsibilities, right? So this nonsense about the fact that, oh, well, we don't know whether it's not CUI, but we will cash the check, that's not acceptable, right? We have to take ownership of our responsibilities, then be able to identify our responsibilities, identify the appropriate resources that provide us the guidance that we need to execute the contract consistent with the security and compliance requirements. Okay, so that's our responsibility as we protect CUI in any form. Okay, also we have to mark that CUI.
Oh, not again.
CUI until it is marked. It gives us explicit guidance. You will mark your information first, and then you will share it. Okay, so it's very clear to us, and it's very clear to everyone. Sorry. It's very clear to us, and it will be very clear to everyone that what the sequence of events that's required are directly reflected within the NIST 800-171 requirements. Okay, so you have to implement the NIST 800-171 requirements you see on the screen, and for all of the other 110 controls to safeguard CUI in accordance with DoD policy, in accordance with what the CUI registry says that you can and cannot do according to the types of CUI that you have during the performance of your work. Okay, so we have to manage our access according to those requirements. Those requirements are communicated through the markings themselves. And so we have to limit that access according to those requirements, and we have to control access and where that can go relative to our environment, both our facilities and within our IT systems. So why is this so important? As I mentioned, I can give you one real world example that saved my life many times is the MQ-9 Reaper, right? After spending, both the beginning of the war effort and then my last rotation after 7 rotations in Afghanistan in 2012. At $30 million a piece and 30 years to mature, we've got the Chinese version of that, which outperforms our version, by the way.
I'm sorry, Regan, we lost your screen.
And it is 1/30 of the cost.
Yeah.
Just a second. Well,
apparently I'm getting notified that we're experiencing problems around the entire area, so sporadic.
All right. Well, we may end up so here's what we'll do, folks. Okay. We will, if we end up running into this again, then we will, because of the unusual nature of of today being election day, we will reschedule to another time if we end up losing power again. Okay. All right. So I don't want to keep you guys on leave and have this stop start. So my apologies. All right. So we got now can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see.
All right. All right. So we got the win long, and the win long is arguably outperforms us at 1/30 the cost and was developed since 2012. So this is a algorithm or a formula, if you will, that is not sustainable, and it is our undoing. And so we must protect this information, and we must protect the defense supply chain that receives this information, develops this information, and shares this information in performance of its contracts in order to prevent our eventual destruction. And if we don't do this, folks, we are done for. So CUI, controlled and classified information, let's start at the very beginning so that we can understand how to identify which information qualifies as CUI. Remember that the relationship in CUI is quintessential between the prime contractor, the DoD and the prime contractor, and all of the other tier suppliers. So when we do something in performance of a contract, a DoD contract, that has the DFAR 7012 contract flow down, okay, 7019, 7020, and eventually the CMC requirement, when we create or possess that information on behalf of the performance of the work, folks, okay, we have CUI. All right. That information is received or developed on behalf of the DoD. Okay. On behalf is important here because when we do it on behalf of the DoD, it doesn't mean that over the 100 categories of CUI, that all of that CUI. What matters is that it's the categories of information that are relative to the performance of the contract. So if privacy information, it may be protected within the state of Texas or within the state of Delaware or within Virginia or within California, but it is not CUI unless it's relative to the performance of the contract. So if it's incidental, meaning it's not relative to the performance of the contract, then it may be protected by something else, but we do not count it as CUI. So when we have CUI in the DoD, oftentimes, but not exclusively, it's export controlled information and controlled technical information. That's important for you to know. If you work with the DOD or a Navy Research Lab or some other organization which co-sponsors information with the Department of Energy, then you have to meet Department of Energy requirements in addition to DoD requirements. But the DoD requirements are specifically within the purview of the CMC requirements themselves. But the requirement is that you do both. Okay, so if it's in the CR registry or if it's agency policy, it must be applied to the implementation of the requirements and performance of the work. So that's all 110 requirements. So it's vital and important we know what is CUI, what categories of CUI that we have, and then what agency policy applies to that CUI. Now, if you're thinking, wow, how am I supposed to do all that? Well, that's why you have people that work for you, or that's the reason why you have broadcasts like this, is to provide to educate you and enable you to do this. Do not reinvent the wheel, folks. I spent thousands and thousands of hours of inventing the wheel, or discovering the wheel, if you will, in codifying this information so that you can use it and you can succeed. So let's start at the beginning of also, well, who's authorized to access CUI? Well, we just told you, and the DoD just told you within the CMC rule itself, that you are an authorized holder. That you are an authorized holder and you are an individual and an organization that is authorized, or perhaps a group of users that's permitted to designate or handle CUI. That's important that you realize because inherent to the definition of being an authorized holder is that word designate. That word designate as defined means that you are going to identify which information is CUI, qualifies as CUI, and then mark it appropriately according to the category of CUI, and then handle it and safeguarding it according to those requirements. That's inherent to the definition of designate, which is inherent to the definition of authorized holder, which the DoD policy delegates you to be an authorized holder underneath this policy. And you'll notice underneath the purpose statement right here at the bottom, notice I apologize for the small font, but notice the bold font just above controlled technical information. It says DFAR section supplement 252.204.7008 and 252.204.712. That means that this policy directly applies to you and the performance of your work. There's no ambiguity about that. There's no uncertainty about that. The CMC rule explicitly tells you that. The DoD Procurement Toolbox, Cybersecurity FAQ, explicitly tells you that. Okay? And DoD policy explicitly tells you that. So when we look at who is responsible for this, it's not the DoD. It's not Daddy. It's not our prime contractor. It's not the guy who cuts up our soccer balls down the street. Okay. It is you. You are responsible for the execution of your work. You're responsible for understanding the information that qualifies as CUI underneath that contract performance, and you're responsible for safeguarding that information. Now, if I'm being, a little bit harsh, um, look, folks, this has been true since December 31st of 2017. You're not paying me at all, and you're spending your precious time with me to understand these requirements with exactness, with certainty, and with confidence, so that you can educate and so that you can execute these requirements. So I apologize if I'm being rough around the edges. At the end of the day, everything I tell you has a reference, has a citation, and if it's not backed up in writing, then you shouldn't believe me. It doesn't matter who I am. It doesn't matter my pedigree. It doesn't matter that I've worked 1 day for the DoD or 1,000 days for the DoD. It doesn't matter if I worked on the served on the cyber AB board. It doesn't matter if I headed standards. None of that matters. Chairman of the CMC Industry Standards Council. None of that matters. What matters is that what I tell you is properly referenced and properly cited, and you can go and look it up for yourself to ensure what I'm telling you is accurate and consistent with the requirements. And most definitely it is. So underneath the 32 CFR 2002, again, remember, is the U.S. Code of Regulations that's not superseded by the CMC rule. Okay. And it says in the general policy underneath marking, prior to disseminating CUI, authorized holders, that's you, must label CUI according to the marking guidance issued by the CUI executive agent. Now, that marking guidance provided by the CUI executive agent is deferred down to the DoD marking guide. Okay. And it must include any specific markings required by law, regulation, and government-wide policy. If it's export controlled information, it must be marked according to the export controlled appropriate requirements, right? If it's controlled technical information, which it would be underneath the DFAR 7012, then it must be marked according to the DoD policy on marking controlled technical information. There's a reasonable expectation that's explicitly stated to you within the 32 CFR 2002 that says to disseminate CUI to anyone as an authorized holder, you must reasonably expect that all intended recipients are authorized to receive CUI and have a basis of how to handle it according to the markings that you provided on it. Okay. So if it qualifies as CUI, it must be marked before you share it. There must be a reasonable expectation shared between you and the recipient that they understand what your markings mean and that they will abide by those requirements. Okay. There are additional expectations as well, but those follow typically underneath DoD policy. So the authorized holder, as an individual, an agency, or organization, okay, are users that are permitted to designate or handle CUI in accordance with the 32 CFR. So the authorized holder, the DoD policy says, is you as a contractor, is you as a subcontractor. And it provides the definition in DoD Instruction 5230.24, which is consistent, by the way, with the CMC rule definition of what a contractor and a subcontractor is. And that the CMC rule states within its citation that it's the 48 CFR part 3.502-1. Okay, so that definition and the definition provided underneath DoD policy and the DoD Instruction 5230.24 are one and the same, folks. So when DoD policy says you as a contractor have specific responsibilities underneath DoD Instruction 5230.24 or DoD Instruction 5248, then you have those responsibilities underneath the contract clause, DFARS 252, 204, 7012. Okay? So if those things that are rattled together don't mean anything to you, then you have yet to do your work, the work required to understand how to meet these requirements. And that's part of this process that I'm delineating out. Now you can tune into our broadcast that resumes tomorrow on the DoD requirements themselves. And I'm talking about not about marking, but about all of the DoD requirements for CMMC. And Xavier can put that in the chat. So feel free. That's part 2 of a 5-part series, and it covers in depth the things that I just rattled off, that it will help you understand how to knit these requirements together. Okay. All right. So underneath the CUI identification marking, why this training matters is because the fact that if you do not properly mark CUI, you cannot inform the recipient and you do not understand the requirements relative to protecting the information that is CUI. Okay. So it is my job as an authorized holder to understand what information qualifies as CUI underneath our DoD performing the DoD contracts in order to ensure that it's properly marked and ensuring to inform any other authorized holders inside of my organization or outside my organization whom I need to share the CUI with in order to perform their portions of their work according to the scope of their duties underneath DoD instruction 8582.01. Okay. So not just anybody can access CUI. It has to be according to the scope of their duties. And because DoD instruction 8582.01 explicitly states that. All right. So just because I work for a company doesn't mean that I have the right or the lawful government purpose to access that CUI. It must be within the scope according to the scope of my duties. So that prevents the misuse. It allows us to maintain the confidentiality, and it helps to prevent unauthorized disclosure. Is it foolproof? No. Is it the super top secret hacker from North Korea? Will it prevent that? Absolutely not. But will it prevent the rampant abuse and rampant and ubiquitous exploitation of our defense data right now? Yes, it will prevent that. Okay. Because why? Because we must have accountability, folks. We must have accountability to ensure that we protect the data that we are entrusted with as a contractor and as a citizen of this great nation. So our responsibilities in marking CUI and information that qualifies as CUI is to understand that we are responsible for marking CUI when we receive it. If it is unmarked, to verify the markings to ensure that it is properly marked when we receive it, and to mark any legacy data only when we reuse that data during the performance of our work. So if we've got hundreds of thousands of documents or tens of thousands of documents from arguably December of 2017 before, do we have to remark them? No, we do not. Do we have to remark them when we repurpose those older documents for the performance of our work now? The answer is yes, absolutely you do. How do I know that? I know that because that's underneath the DoD cybersecurity FAQ and the DoD procurement toolbox. And that's also within DoD guidance itself and the DoD instruction 5248. And that's also within the instructions with the response to public comments within the CMC rule itself. All right. So now that we've laid that foundation, let's get into the more practical aspects. Now, here's what I've told you up until now. I've told you up until now that there's no space, there's no air, no distance between the 32 CFR 2002 and the protection of CUI and the CMC rule. There's no space that it is a hand and a glove. The CMC rule fits over the protection of CUI requirements like a glove in order to validate the fact that you've done what you are already supposed to do. No new requirements. So now we have to understand, well, what information qualifies as CUI? And then how do I apply the current requirements in DoD policy to that information? And that's the meat and potatoes of today. All right. So let's get down to brass tacks. Most manufacturing contracts, and again, this is because manufacturing that needs the most help. Most manufacturing contracts do build to print. They do build to spec. They do build to order, engineer to order, assembly to order, or prototype manufacturing for the DoD. When we do these things and we do it according to the DoD technical specification, and we need that technical information in order to fulfill our performance of the work, whether that's from Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or great companies like General Dynamics or BAE Systems, and we're the 27th tier contractor or we're the 3rd tier contractor. None of that matters. What matters is that the information that we receive, the technical information that we receive, qualifies CUI so that we can perform our work. And if we happen to maybe be a mid or large or even a small contractor in the DoD, do our vendors need the technical information that the DoD provides us, or we provide or the DoD has asked us to develop in performance of our work, do they need that technical information to perform their duties and their responsibilities as subcontractors? If your answer is to yes to all those questions, then you receive technical information that is required to be protected and qualifies as CUI either as controlled technical information or qualifies as CUI as export controlled information. And I will show you how that's true and consistent with the standard itself. So this is a summary. Now, you're not going to find this anywhere. This is what DTC Global and Regan Edens put together to sort of describe, if you will, how to apply what I'm telling you in a very practical way for your manufacturing organization. Okay. Now, it brings together, it's a composite application of all the things that I know in order for you to understand, what's CUI when we do assembly to order type of contracts or build to spec. Now, I was remiss to mention the fact that you are welcome to screenshot this brief. The slides themselves will not be provided. And you are welcome to use these screenshots for your own personal use. I ask you, if you're a consultant out there, I'm happy that you're here. You're a great enabling and technology organization. I'm happy that you're here, but I'm asking you to not repurpose our intellectual property for your own commercial reuse. Okay. So remember I mentioned other authoritative sources for guidance, which is the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, and that has an FAQ of their own. And in very simply, it says who can create CUI, and anyone can create CUI, and we've shown you how that's true, and and how that's reflected within DoD policy, and we've also shown you how that's true and reflected within the CMC rule and the response to public comments. As long as it's generated by or behalf an executive branch agency, that's the DoD, okay, underneath the contract, which is the DFAR 7012, or when we're validating the CMC requirements, the 7021 clause. And it could be any one of any hundred of categories. Remember that it has to be CUI that's relevant to your performance of your work. So remember, privacy is a good example. Our social security number is protected, so most certainly it is privacy information. But if I'm not performing, services out in a combat zone, then it's very unlikely that my privacy information with my social security number is CUI. Okay. When people are the product, you can use this as a rule. When people are the product, then their privacy information probably is going to be CUI, their training records or medical records. When they're providing a service for the DoD or related to the DoD performed work. But when you're making stuff and you're doing technology or performance or developing or products or providing services related to the development of stuff, then it's very unlikely that privacy is going to be a factor. So let's talk about this. So marking. Well, let's see. You've told me a lot. You talk really fast, Regan. You cover a lot of ground. I don't know that I can absorb all this. I totally get it. If you notice that our slides are very dense, and that's intentional, I want our slides to be a reference for you after we spend time together, okay? And if I put 3 bullet points on a slide, that wouldn't be very helpful for you, now would it? And my intention is to arm and equip you with knowledge, okay? So it's vital and important that we take time and we go through things piece by piece because there's a lot to cover in a little bit of time, not to mention power outages, all right? So let's go back with, when do I have to properly mark something? Well, if it's identified the contract performance, you betcha. Okay. How's that identifying the contract performance? In the DFAR 7012. The DFAR 7012 requires you to protect CUI, which requires you to institute the NIST 800-171 requirements, which requires you to follow the DoD policy while you're doing so. Guess what? There we go. We're required to mark CUI. No ambiguity, no uncertainty. Okay. What about if we get a security classification guide? You betcha. Security classification guide is a very important document that describes how you're going to classify different aspects of the information relative to the performance of your work. Is it going to tell you bolt by bolt? No, not at all. Okay. It's going to break it down in general descriptions, and it's going to give you guidance on what types of information is protected underneath what classification. Generally, you get a security classification guide when you have a mixed bag. When you have a mixed bag of classified and controlled and classified information. Generally, you don't get a security classification guide with a program that's fully CUI or export controlled. Okay, DD254 also the same thing. Is it common for an organization on tier 3 to ever receive a security classification guide? No, it's not common at all. In fact, it would be very rare for you to do so. What about if you asked your prime contractor for the security classification guide? That's difficult to do also, because they're hesitant, because there are portions and pieces that are relative to them that aren't relative to you. Okay, so well, what do we do? Well, guess what? DoD policy provides for you to how to understand what information qualifies as CUI and how to handle it and mark it appropriately. All right. So if we have a DFAR 7012 clause, it is presumptive that you're likely to have CUI. If you don't have CUI, then it's important that you know that so that you can have that clause removed. Okay? Because if you don't have the clause removed, you're going to be contractually obligated to meet the requirements to the clause. So how do we know that these elements are a part of the types of technical information that we handle in performance of our work? That primary reference is the DoD instruction 5230.24. Those of you who are astute will recognize that in the CUI registry, it actually mentions DoD instruction 5230.24 and the definition of what controlled technical information is. You betcha. That's the cornerstone document of DoD policy, which informs you about what is controlled technical information. So we recognize all of these aspects of the performance of our work, and if we haven't been savvy about these aspects, we need to be aware. If we're aware of the risk of CMMC and we're aware of the risk of the 7012 contract clause, then we need to be aware of the guidance and the requirements relative to the protection of the CUI. So the CUI must be properly marked at the top and the bottom. That's required underneath 32 CFR 200.20, which is the marking guidance provided by NARA, and that marking guidance provided by NARA is reflected within DoD policy. Well, where's it reflected within DoD policy? It's reflected in DoD policy in the DoD instruction 5248, and it's also reflected in the instruction of the DoD CUI marking guide. Okay, so we're going to go over each of these aspects in particular. So there's a CUI designated indicator box, and that CUI designated indicator box has very specific fields that must be filled in when they're known. If you don't know what the information is, it is your obligation, your responsibility to go find out. Okay, so you have to know the destination and end use of the information that you're required to either protect or you're required to provide. Okay, that is your responsibility. It's your responsibility underneath export control requirements. It's your responsibility underneath DoD policy. Make no mistake about that, folks. Okay, no one is going to hold your hand. So if we are going to thrive and not just survive CMMC, we must become we must develop subject matter expertise about the things that I'm telling you. When it's appropriate, or when we want to use a a CUI marking cover sheet, we can. We are allowed to underneath DoD policy. We are not allowed. We are allowed to underneath NARA CUI guidance, and we can use those things. If you have a CUI supply, you can go there and you can order them by the bucket load. Right, as many CUI marking marking cover sheets as you like, right? All pre-ordered, pre-packaged. All that you got to do is buy them and ship them right to you, and then mark them yourself, right? There's even fields that are provided within the cover sheets that are pre-printed, so that you don't burn up your purple print, and also so that you just fill in the blank. It's keep it simple, stupid. All right. So remember that those cover sheets are also used when we cannot adequately mark a document. Maybe we can't underneath the contract terms, we can't modify the documents that we receive. Well, then we would take our CUI cover sheet and we would add that to the document that we're not allowed to mark, and those two things would come together, and the CUI cover sheet would have all of the appropriate markings, and we would use that in electronic form or printed form, whichever is appropriate, and they would be together, and they would not ever be separated after that. So let's talk about, is this CUI? Okay, so we touched a little bit on the marking requirements. We touched a little bit on the regulatory and the requirements according to the CMC rule, and the guidance provided in the responsive public comments. The part of the requirements underneath the 32 CFR Part 2002, and we've also touched a bit on the requirements relative to the DoD policy. Now let's look at the information that qualifies as CUI, because we're gonna if you haven't recognized it yet, you got a lot more CUI than you ever could have imagined, and that is going to be true, folks. Okay, so take a deep breath and let's walk through this together. So, the CMC requirements, I'm reminding you of this because I've already told you this. The CMC requirements apply to prime contractors and subcontractors throughout the supply chain at all tiers that will process, store, or transmit any FCI or CUI on contractor information systems in the performance of the contract or subcontract, irrespective of the origin of the information. So that means the information could come from directly from the DoD. That's called primary distribution of CUI. That information could come through secondary distribution of CUI. That means from one of their subcontractors down to you. You could also develop that CUI and performance of the work. And remember, I previously told you that you have to protect that CUI, even though you may not share it with anyone. You're only protecting it within the performance of your own work. You still must meet requirements. You still must handle CUI appropriately. So remember a little touch on the security classification guide. How do we know how to mark CUI? Okay. Well, we may get a DD 254. That would be rare if you're a tier supplier. We may get a security classification guide. That would be even more rare if you were a tier supplier. We can take the original documents and we can do derivative markings from those documents when it's appropriate. Okay. That's the very first thing that we should always try is use one of those three documents, and DoD policy provides for us guidance on, yes, we can request those documents. Well, can you request them from the DoD? Yeah, you could, but it's very unlikely that that's a reality within the defense supply chain. The reality is that you will have to take the originating documents, if they're properly marked, and then do derivative markings from those, which is perfectly fine. The DoD policy and the DoD process described within the policy absolutely provides this. There is no restriction from you doing this, and in fact, it's encouraged. Why would it be encouraged? Well, it's encouraged because the DoD wants you to protect the information. The DoD requires you to mark it prior to sharing it, and so if you make a mistake, the DoD policy provides for the corrections to those mistakes. Okay, no penalties, folks. So there's no excuse. So if we have an original document, we can derive information from those original documents to help guide us in developing our CUI and marking it appropriately, or developing derivative CUI from those original documents. Okay. And that's how we would take those DoD program guides, if it's available. We would go back to the CUI registry to understand what types of CUI that we have. And we go and we look to DoD policy to provide us guidance, which we'll talk about. And then we would work to, we would use and reference the DoD CUI marking guide in order to apply the appropriate markings and to mark CUI. So all of these things are described within DoD policy. Reagan's not making it up. I know the people have not done a very good job in understanding these requirements. That's I'm not sure perfectly normal, but the reality is we have primary distribution that is described in DoD policy. We have secondary distribution that's described in DoD policy, and we have the guidance which I'm providing you provided within DoD policy and DoD authoritative guidance. And that is reinforced and invigorated within the CMC rules, responsive public comments itself. So if we look at the workflow, and this is an example of a workflow, okay, understanding our CUI in our workflow, we can understand is that we need to go through a CUI discovery process and try to identify what CUI is received in the performance of our work, what CUI is developed in the performance of our work. Where do we share CUI, and who is it shared with, and how do we share it, and where is CUI stored? All of this requires us to ensure that we mark CUI in the beginning of the process, and when we develop CUI during the performance of our work, wherever it may be developed, that it's properly marked. Okay. So when we develop CUI during the performance of our contract, I'm going to show you through the definitions why that's true and why it is that all of the CUI, what we call DTC Global calls the CUI stakeholders, why the CUI stakeholders are likely spread throughout the entire depth and breadth of your workflow in the performance of your work is because you're going to be shocked about the definition and the contributing definitions to technical information, and you're also going to be shocked when you take a look and you begin to apply that where all of that information, technical information, flows, and it flows everywhere because most organizations don't have very much discipline when it comes to limiting the flow of technical information. Okay. So that tends to get away from us. And this is what must be done as a cornerstone to scoping. You cannot be successful in scoping unless you do this. Why? Because there are places that CUI is not permitted to flow. There are places where CUI must be restricted. There are places where the NIST Standard 171 does not allow to have access to CUI within configuration management, the configuration management domain 346 and 347 within the essential capabilities alone that CUI must flow. Okay, so all of these things are vital and essential to you narrowing the scope of where the CUI flows and confining it only to the performance of the contract. So again, now that we've learned a lot, let's go back to the fundamentals. Now we've understood that we're performing a DoD contract. We understand that we're performing either a prime contract or a subcontract relative to the performance of that work. We understand that we need technical specifications to do our job in order to perform our segment of the work. And we also understand that we need to be able to share some certain technical information to others and the performance of their responsibilities and for us to deliver what we've been asked to do. We also understand the fact that underneath those requirements, we need to know what DoD policy says about protecting that information and what information qualifies as CUI, and then how to mark it appropriately. And that allows us to protect that information. It allows us to prevent the misuse of CUI and to prevent, obviously, unauthorized disclosure, and to ensure that we hold everyone who receives CUI in the performance of the work accountable for meeting these requirements. And that, my friends, is the cornerstone for validating, doing the validation and the assessment that CMMC requires. So now we can look at this in a new light. Now we've got all of these responsibilities, or all of these areas that we have technical information. And the question is how do we know that that information qualifies as CUI? I mean, it's technical information, and yeah, we need it to perform our contracts, our DoD contracts, but how do we know it's CUI, or it's controlled technical information, or it's export controlled technical information? And the answer is the way that we know is because we look to DoD instruction 5230.24. Now, did I make that up? No, I didn't make that up. If we go to the CUI registry right now, the NARA CUI registry or the DoD CUI registry, and we look in the definition of controlled technical information, it explicitly states within the definition this DoD instruction, that this DoD instruction provides the guidance for understanding what controlled technical information is. Okay? So it has nothing to do whether the controlled technical information is properly marked. That has nothing to do whether or not it is or qualifies for controlled technical information. What matters is that the controlled technical information has the same attributes that are described in DoD instruction 5230.24. So if you've never heard of this instruction, this is something that you absolutely need because it establishes, if you look at the bold print, I know it's small, it establishes a standard framework and markings for managing, sharing, and safeguarding and distributing technical information in accordance with national and operational security, privacy, records management, intellectual property, federal procurement, and export control policies, regulations, and laws. That's all that you need to know about why this document is the cornerstone document for identifying controlled technical information. Okay, so let's walk through. The first step, I've got a technical drawing. It's unmarked. Is it CUI? The answer is, well, it certainly could be. Is it technical information relative to the performance of the work? Yes. And oh, by the way, all the documents that I'm providing for you are entirely fictitious documents, right? That none of them are actually CUI. That would be not allowed. It would be against the rules, you would think, right? For me to share a actual CUI document with you over a public broadcast. Why? Because it's not public information. So this is a fictional representation that could be from any company. Okay. So unmarked CUI, is it CUI? Well, it is CUI if it qualifies as CUI. And if it qualifies as CUI, we must treat it and protect it according to the requirements within the CUI registry. And the CUI registry tells us in controlled technical information and export controlled information that we have to follow the requirements according to the DoD policy. And we have to apply either the ITAR or the EAR as appropriate. So that's the very first step. Identify the fact that we've got a technical document in the performance of a DoD contract. It's got a DFAR 7012, and guess what? It's not marked properly, but it sure does look and smell like CUI. Okay. Well, we go to the DoD procurement toolbox, and guess what? In the cybersecurity question FAQ question 22, what information should be identified and marked in accordance with DFAR 7012? Well, the answer is any information provided by or for the DoD that requires dissemination and safeguarding controls pursuant and consistent with the laws, regulations, and government-wide policies, and should be safeguarded in accordance with DFAR 7012. Well, how do I know that? Well, I know that because why? Because the DoD procurement toolbox tells me why. The CUI registry, that's the public registry, authorized categories and subcategories of information that requires safeguarding and dissemination controls pursuant and consistent with the laws, regulations, and government-wide policies, is explained in DoD Manual 5200.01, Volume 4, DoD Controlled and Classified Information, and DoD Instruction 5230.24. So that's where DoD policy has told us for the last 3 years, folks. This is not new. For the well, this may be actually be 4 years old. For the last 4 years, how do you know what controlled technical information is? It's been right there all along. So if the information has a distribution statement and it's on the technical document, then you must most certainly CTI. Why? Because DoD policy and DoD Instruction 5248 and 5230.24 says that all technical information that qualifies as CUI must be labeled with a distribution statement that informs us how to protect the information. Okay, so if it doesn't have a distribution statement, then we have to mark it with one. And where do we go to get that information? Well, that's a part of step 2 and step 3 and step 4 and step 5. So this right here, either whether you knew it or not, has provided you the keys to the kingdom about understanding what controlled technical information is the entire time, folks. It is not the CMC rules responsibility to tell you what controlled technical information is. The CMC rules responsibility is to tell you that you already know what controlled technical information is, even if you don't know. It is to inform you that DoD policy and guidance already provides you the answers to your questions. But the CMC rules' main purpose and responsibility is to assess you through a third-party assessor to ensure that you're doing exactly what's described in the DoD procurement toolbox. There's no ambiguity. There's no uncertainty about what I just told you. So if we look at what technical information that's in the DoD instruction, I didn't make this up. These definitions come straight from the DoD instruction 5230.24. In fact, you could Google that right now, and you could pull that down from the White House documents, okay? And you could open it up yourself, and you could read these exact same definitions word for word. Controlled technical information, I'm going to share 2 of them, which are the most important, and they illustrate what the other 4 are telling you. Controlled technical information is technical information with a military and space application that's subject to controls on the access, use, reproduction, modification, performance, display, release, disclosure, distribution. Controlled technical information does not include information that's general and scientific in nature, mathematic principles commonly taught in schools, colleges, universities, or information that's lawfully within the public domain. The CTI definition doesn't use the word lawfully because it doesn't have to. because the definition of CUI does use the word lawfully. So if it's lawfully in the public domain, it is not CUI. So if it is in the public domain, it is not controlled technical information because if it's lawfully publicly available, it's not CUI. It's not CTI. So the question you might ask is, well, what's technical information? If it's technical information with military and space applications, so technical data or computer software of any kind, any kind, any kind, yes, any kind that can be used, adapted, or for use in the design, in the production, in manufacturing, in the assembly, in the repair, in the overhaul, processing, in engineering and development and operation and maintenance and adapting and testing and reconstruction of any goods or materials or any technology that advances the state of the art, establishes new art in the area of significant military applicability in the United States. If it's described in DoD Instruction 5230.24, you can rest assured it is controlled technical information. Okay? Engineering information, skip all the way down. Engineering information. Well, wait. Technical information, engineering information. Well, what kind of engineering information? Engineering information is engineering data used for design, development, test, manufacture, acceptance, training, operation, maintenance, overhaul. The principal types of information are engineering drawings and associated lists, including parts lists, by the way. So is a part on a DoD contract that's unique, a non-commercial item that's unique to the performance of the work, is that part number CUI? The answer is yes. That's inconvenient, I know. Well, wait, all right, that means our ERP system is involved. Yes, 100%. If it is information that qualifies as CUI, irrespective of whether it's convenient or not, it is CUI. So that parts list, data list, index list, manufacturing specifications, standards, data sheets, test reports, bills of material. Bills of material aren't protected underneath export control requirements. That's true. They're protected underneath control technical information. Oh, okay. So bills of material. Yes, bills of material. Handbooks, technical orders, manuals, engineering changes, technical data packages, and other technical documents that provide data on reliability, maintainability, endowment application, and quality control. You mean to tell me that quality control information that's been used or gathered during test and evaluation of proving the fact that the fit, form, or function meets the technical specifications is CUI? Yes, it is CUI. No one has ever told me that before. That's my job, is to tell you things that no one has ever told you before. Does that make it not true? No, it is true. It is true because it's not because Reagan said it. It's true because it's consistent and accurate with the standard that the DoD cites to provide you an understanding of the information that qualifies as control technical information and a CUI. That's what makes it true. So the information that qualifies, to summarize, it's CTI if it's subject to controls underneath the DFAR 7012. Yep. If it's used in production of military and space application, you betcha. If it's used in all those different examples, yes. If it's technical data or specifications, 100%. Engineering information, you betcha. In any form whatsoever. The part itself, you betcha. It's a representation of the form, right? And if you read DoD Instruction 5230.24, it explicitly states in any form. Parts and representations. Well, what do you know? Parts and representations. Documents, images, discussions, graphics, you betcha. So any of that information that can be accessed, can be viewed, or the opportunity to access or view, that constitutes access to CUI. Yes, 100%. Is there any doubt about that? There is no doubt. None whatsoever. Zero. So when I put the pieces of the puzzle together, if we look at the graphic on the left-hand side, if it's being used for the DoD and it falls into the ITAR ER category, you betcha, it's going to be CUI. If it's unique or modified or custom to the DoD application, you betcha, it is CUI. Well, what if it's a COTS item? What if it's that bolt? It hasn't changed. It's a mil-spec bolt. We can buy it off the internet. We can buy it at Home Depot. Well, that bolt is not CUI. Well, what happens when I add that bolt to the bill of materials? Well, the bill of materials is CUI. Well, what happens when I add the part number on the bill of materials for that bolt? That part number is CUI. Is the bolt CUI? The bolt itself isn't CUI. Do you have to protect it? You have to protect it like CUI when you put it together, right? When you put it in the bin for the assembly, because that bin constitutes the parts and pieces and representations of the information which is to be protected because it qualifies as CUI and it is restricted and it is not available through public access lawfully. So all of that technical information and the representations and the derivative information relative to that, are you telling me that that's all CUI and all controlled technical information? And if it's export controlled, then it would be export controlled information. The answer is yes. Is there any uncertainty about that? There's none. Zero. And there's about 20 different citations that I could put together on a single sheet that could explain that in exacerbating detail. And I do have that information, by the way. So, all right. Well, let's that's a little bit of a cold shower. I totally get that. No one has ever told me that before. I totally get that. I do. Am I really genuinely empathetic? I am. And although I'm being a little bit snarky, okay, because you've got to break this up. The reality, though, is this, folks, is I know this is a hard thing it is a jagged little pill, but it's only a jagged little pill that you choose to swallow because you want to perform the work. If you do not want to perform the work, if you want to give 20 or 30% of your revenue away to your competitor, then don't do the work. Don't do it. Just go do something else and do it well, right? Because you're going to have to make up that revenue. But if you want that 20 or 30% that you have now or more maybe of revenue plus your competitor's revenue, then you will do the work because this is the greatest opportunity and probably the history of the DoD to expand your market share because there will be people who will not do the work, folks. Our DTC Global clients have probably bought a top line revenue growth of probably a minimum of 25% of their top line revenue growth because they did the work and because they are stealing their competitors' lunch money right now. But my friends, this all hinges on eligibility. You must do this to be eligible for the contract because you're not eligible unless you affirm in writing to the DoD and unless you certify by a third party that you've done the work. And that freight train is going to run, it's going to leave without you. It's going to run over you if you do not do the work. So I encourage you to do the work. So technical information. These are some examples. These are applied examples. You won't see these in DoD or you'll see words. Obviously, I didn't just make these words up, right? But we're applying the words in the policy to examples so that you have a much better understanding of how this is actually applied. Engineering information, the same thing. How do I understand that the nature and purpose of what the DoD instruction is telling me and apply that to what we actually do in our contracts? Well, this is using our experience to actually apply that and to see that how does that happen in real world and the details which you may experience in the performance of your work. Configuration management documentation is pretty important because that's all of the things that do fit, form, and function, performance, operation, reliability, maintainability, quality control, configuration management of all the engineering information, the engineering changes, all of those things that take place during a product lifecycle all take place underneath the definition of configuration management, and that definition of configuration management falls underneath the spectrum of the definition for technical information. Manufacturing tolerances, okay, that's not explicitly used within the 5230.24, but the manufacturing tolerances are the things that you use that are specified by the DoD, the technical information, to actually perform the work. And anyone who's done manufacturing out there knows that the difference between a hundredth of an inch and a thousandth of an inch is everything. And so if the DoD wants you to do a thousandth of an inch and you do a hundredth of an inch because you don't have that technical information, you can't perform the work. It's never going to pass. So you need the technical information unique to the performance of the work in order to actually execute the work according to the DoD standard, the DoD expectation, or the prime contractor's expectation of you as a subcontractor. Those tolerances, my friends, fall within the scope of the definition of technical information. We just put them in everyday jargon. The bills of material is explicitly stated. Okay. And so those bills of material come in all breadths and shapes and sizes. And you be rest assured that bills of material falls within the spectrum of the contributing definitions to technical information and assembly instructions as well, and quality controls and test procedures. Right. Those are the same. And performance and operation specifications. You betcha, because they fall underneath the spectrum of the technical information relative to the performance and operation maintainability that's described in configuration management, okay, and engineering information. So these information, though we apply them in common ways, have their roots within the DoD definition itself. Okay. All right. So we are started at 3 and we're coming up on 421. So we are going to cover these things in blistering speed because we're actually halfway through the slide deck. It's a lot of information, folks. So designating, I told you that CUI is required to be designated according to an authorized holder. Okay. I'm sorry. That's according to the DoD policy. An authorized holder has the inherent responsibility, it's part of the definition of authorized holder, to designate CUI, and that occurs when an authorized holder, that's you, or an organization, consistent with CUI requirements, determines that the information falls into the CUI category and subcategory. Where do we get that information delegated to us? It's through DoD policy itself. And that policy was reflected in one of the first or second slides that I showed you within the guidance provided within the authoritative guidance within the CMC rule and the response to public comments. So CUI designates CUI, and because the reason why they do that is because they have to make sure that the recipient is aware of the category CUI prior to sharing it. Okay, that's a principal governing factor of access. Okay, so if we don't designate CUI, we can't protect its confidentiality. We can't prevent it from being misused. We cannot prevent it from being disclosed to unauthorized persons, and we certainly can't ensure that the accountability for protecting the CUI because it's not marked with the appropriate markings required to inform us on how to safeguard it. So remember, what does it take to mark CUI properly? Banner, CUI at the top, footer, CUI at the bottom, the distribution statement that's required underneath 5230.24 for technical information, and also the CUI designated indicator box. Now you may ask me, Regan, wait a second. What's the word I'm looking for? The CUI marking guide does not say that we have to put this the distribution statement in there. You're right, it doesn't. It says, well, what's the distribution statement in the CUI and the CUI designated indicator box? But remember that the CUI marking guide is not for just controlled technical information. It's for all CUI. It's general guidance for CUI. Well, where do we get specific guidance about marking controlled technical information? Well, that comes in DoD Instruction 5248. That also comes in the DoD Instruction 5230.24. Why is that true? Because the DoD Instruction 5248 says to follow the guidance in a marking controlled technical information that's provided within the 5230.24. So we saw this, okay, this marking overview slide, and now you're probably going to see this in a totally different light. All right. Oftentimes when we have CUI, we have responsibilities. It may be partially marked. It may be fully unmarked. It may be incorrectly marked. Incorrectly marked has its own different path, and that's underneath 32 CFR Part 2002.50. Okay, and that's a totally different thing that I won't have time to cover here. And in reality, I've never heard of anyone ever challenging designation of CUI. And I've literally looked at thousands of documents over hundreds and hundreds of hours. Okay, so that's never happened. and you should not have any expectation that that's real for the average defense manufacturer organization out there. All right. So we got about 5 minutes. So we're gonna go through this, and it's gonna be explicit now that we've set this real strong foundation of knowledge about why you're doing what you're doing, because the doing of the marking is pretty simple. Pretty simple. Okay. So first step in marking is to identify the CUI in any form. Second step is to identify the category of CUI, because we have to mark it according to the category and that the information qualifies as. We review any markings or check sources that provide us guidance on the marking of the document. We identify the proper access limitations to restrictions that are related to that document in the performance of our work. And we mark it correctly, and we safeguard it according to those markings. And we inform others about those markings and the safeguarding requirements. And we do that in the form of the marking itself. Okay. So when we mark a document, we are informing others that the information is CUI, and the document itself provides the safeguarding mechanisms to protect that CUI. And that allows us to reasonably ensure that everyone who accesses that CUI should understand how to read the document, look at the document, recognize the safeguarding requirements, and then follow those safeguarding requirements. If we do not have that reasonable expectation that they know what they're doing, then we cannot share CUI with them, and we cannot provide access. So we're going to go through this one more time, or one time together. So we've got a completely fictitious. Again, I want to be clear. Okay, this is not a stealth or warfighting weapon system. Okay, it's completely fictitious CUI diagram. Okay, so Acme Manufacturing's got this. Okay, consistent with any other that could be out there. Well, and this is technical information. This is engineering information. It's in performance of a DoD contract. We know that because Acme Manufacturing, we provide them information, or we are Acme Manufacturing, could be both examples, and we're doing this in performance of a DoD contract. So there's no ambiguity about the fact that this is for a DoD contract, and there's no ambiguity about the fact that this is definitely technical information. And if we look on here, it's got a distribution statement D. That means in that little small print there, that distribution statement tells us that it is technical information. Because if it is technical information, it's defined underneath that definition of technical information, and we got to protect it. Okay, so this is definitely a graphic that we're going to use, design, the engineering drawing that we're going to use in the production, manufacturing, assembly, repair, overall processing, engineering, development, operation, maintenance, adapting, testing, or reconstruction of goods and materials of any technology that the DoD would use. So there's no ambiguity about that. So this is also engineering information that we mentioned previously, and it meets underneath the definition of DoD Instruction 5230.24 explicitly, right? There's no doubt. This is definitely engineering information. And it's configuration management information, because it definitely follows within the fit, form, and function of the thing that we're building for the DoD. Okay. So, and we would manage this with engineering changes. So this is definitely configuration management documentation as well. So is this a DoD project? You betcha, 100%. Because if we check this, if we didn't know that, if we weren't Acme Manufacturing, we would look at this legend, and here we go. It is a military space application, because we know that we provide widgets to Acme Manufacturing. And yes, it's for DoD contract or prime contract or subcontract, and it's for a DoD program, because that sort of information would be found in the legend if the document had the appropriate markings. So all of these marks have been checked, and yes, this absolutely qualifies for a distribution statement if it already doesn't have one. Okay, so we would look at the distribution statement. The definition is right there on your left. That's appropriate if it weren't previously marked. But in this case, though, the definition or the distribution statement is already marked. If it didn't have a distribution statement, then we would look into the DoD Instruction 5230.24, and we would look up either from an original document about what the appropriate distribution statement would be. And oftentimes it's never A, because that's public release. It's not B, because it's a DoD contract or federal agency only. So it's usually going to be D or F. Okay. So I'm sorry, D or E. All right. So that C, D, or E, it could be C, D, or E. My apologies. So using C, D, or E, it could fall under any of those categories, or if there were a murder list, that would be category F. All right. So now we have a distribution statement. We pulled this from either an original document, or we inferred this from a previous document, and it's oftentimes C, D, or F, right? F would be sometimes is the rare example, rare exception. How do we know that? We know that because we already looked at FAQ 22, and FAQ 22 told us to go through this exact same process. Okay, technical documents and describe the procedures to designate or mark a DoD CUI. When we went through the DoD instruction 5230.24 and we followed that exact same process. And then now we have the appropriate distribution statement. We mark it, okay, and we are good to go. Okay, this document now almost meets the full definition of control technical information, except for it's missing a couple things. We're going to need to mark it as CUI at the top and CUI at the bottom. Okay, and so we would have a header, and the header would be would have CUI at the top and CUI at the bottom. And if it were export controlled information, it would also qualify as CUI as well. Remember, we in answer 28. Okay, let's see. So if we're not sure that it's export controlled information, then we need to check with our export control compliance person, or we definitely need to check with the higher tier contractor, because that can get you in really deep trouble. If it's export controlled information, we're going to handle those materials according to the DO requirements and according to the appropriate ITAR or EAR requirements that's unique to those requirements. Okay, and if it's appropriate to mark it with an export controlled warning statement, then we would mark it with an export controlled warning statement according to DoD policy, which is expressed here in within the quotation marks. So we've got CUI at the top, we've got CUI at the bottom. We added the export controlled warning statement. We've got the DoD distribution statement, and lo and behold, guess what? Now we know that it is CUI. Okay, now we're 3 minutes over, so now we're going to go ahead and stop, and we're going to take questions. Okay, all right. So with that, let's go through the questions.
Yeah, we're down to 3 questions in the Q&A.
Oh, that's not bad. You're welcome, Corin. Thank you so much. You're so kind. So, 3 questions. I can't believe there are only 3 questions. It's hard to believe, actually. 72. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, you answered a few while you were talking.
Yeah. So Danny, great to see you. Appreciate you as always. Danny's pretty consistent, I think, on our broadcasts. Is there any provision for redacting or critical details for something marked as CUI and creating our own document that is no longer CUI? Now, Danny, there is. So redaction, let's see. Redaction is a highly technical process, okay? And redaction never alleviates you from the liability getting it wrong. That's number one, okay? Redaction only alleviates you from the liability if you get it right. So it depends upon the situation and depends upon the type of information. Now, is redaction described in DoD policy? It is not. The process of redaction is not mentioned in DoD instruction 5230.24, nor in DoD FAQ. But DoD redaction is an approved method for removing information that would meet a specific category classification. Now, normally, that redaction is reviewed, okay, by a DoD authority if you were inside the DoD, okay, or you were trying to redact something. It's not the same as decontrolling. That's a totally different thing. Decontrolling is a process that's controlled by the DoD. But redaction requires you to obscure or to remove all the information that is CUI. Now, the question is what value would the document be to the person whom you're sharing it with? So what I would argue with this is that you may redact some areas of the technical information that the supplier or the vendor does not need. That certainly that's a method of redaction. But does that mean that the document they would receive would have no CUI? I'm not sure that there would be any value in sharing a redacted document that didn't have any CUI, right? If technical information is needed to perform the work. So that's a technical process. I used to teach redaction some time ago, but it honestly, I worry that people will misunderstand it and they will get themselves into trouble. Is it worth doing? It is worth assuming the risk underneath very tightly controlled circumstances. That circumstance is usually a business decision, not a compliance decision, not a security decision, but do we want to go through the process of taking the time to technically redact a document for some outcome that is very valuable to us as a business. And that's the decision matrix that I would mean. And then you go back to the security and compliance people, and then you say, is all of the CUI removed from this document that's appropriate for whatever reason? And if the answer is no, then it's not redacted. Or if the answer is, well, we want to redact only a portion of the information because this particular supplier doesn't need it. Okay, that's fair. So you can certainly do that, but then I would consider doing a derivative document from that. The derivative document you're fully allowed to do underneath secondary distribution, but you still would have to properly mark and identify the derivative document, and they would be fully responsible for meeting all the appropriate safeguarding requirements appropriate to the categories of CUI contained within the derivative document. Let me know if that answers your question. So, anonymous attendee, I'd like to start getting into parts procurement for USG. Okay, that's fair. Is there a definitive list of what NSN or PNs are export controlled? There is not. So do not rely. This is just experience talking here. Do not rely on NSNs to not include export controlled information. The reason for that is because the DoD has a process called commercial item determination. And in commercial item determination, you would think, well, wait a second, commercial item determination, that would mean that items that are export controlled can't be determined to be a commercial item. And surprising to me, the answer is no, that's not true. An item can go through the DoD's process for commercial item determination underneath, you can look this up, underneath the commercial item determination group, the SIG, okay? And the process called commercial item determination. I think it's part B of the process is the document available. It has been updated to CUI and DoD CMC requirements, so it's not compatible. All right, but you can go through the process of commercial item determination, and the item still be export controlled. Okay, and I have submitted to the DoD a question, which is if the item is determined to be a commercial item and is still export controlled underneath the commercial item group, does that mean it's exempt from the DFAR 7012 requirements? And the answer in plain reading is no, but we're still waiting on the response to the DoD for that. So if you didn't follow that, that's a really, really, really complex set of discussions, and that is within, if you Xavier can put into our dtcglobal.us webinars, and we did a one of the most technically challenging broadcast on commercial item determination and this process. That was before the final rule, but again, the final rule doesn't change anything. It just ensures that you're responsible for doing it. So I hope that was helpful, anonymous attendee. So another anonymous attendee, is there a guidebook that walks us through a cybersecurity process step by step? There is not. It is with great conviction that we and me personally, DTC Global, have been working on something we call CMMC EPU, and we literally have over, I don't know, somewhere between 14 and 16,000 man hours in developing a definitive guide, not the only way, but a way of meeting requirements and being bulletproof. Okay, but that is not yet publicly available, and we are working on automating that that documentation so that it's very helpful to you. And we will make that likely publicly available through the CMC Industry Standards Council. Okay. But there's a process. And DTC Global's got to do some work and work on automating it. So I wish there were. There's not. Okay. Nor will there be. The DoD, when I was working on Cyber AB, the accreditation body, as a one of the founding directors, both Dr. Ross and the DoD told each of us respectively that there will be no how-to manual. And if you haven't noticed already, the NIST 800-171 is not a how-to manual. The reason for that is because it assumes that you're developing an environment from scratch, from a blank sheet of paper. That's the way it's written. It is not written to inform you how to convert an existing commercial entity into a NIST 800-171 compliant environment. That does not exist, folks. All right. So, and I would be very, very hesitant there are less than 5 people that I know in this entire CMMC ecosystem who are skilled enough to provide you that information. Okay. So please, with the greatest sense of concern, do not follow your average Joe or average Jane. And it doesn't matter whether they have certified this or certified that. There are only a handful of people who are capable of doing that. And it's very unlikely that they're one of them. Okay. So Anna Mumford, is ITAR considered CUI as well? It is, Anna. So underneath the cybersecurity FAQ, okay, you can Google this, DoD procurement toolbox, and then go to the toolbox, and then go down to the say cybersecurity FAQ, and double click on that, and then it'll take you to the top, and there'll be a little link there, and that'll download a document. You don't go to the document, it just download it. Download that document. That'll take you to answer 28, FAQ question 28, and it will tell you explicitly that export controlled information, whether it's ITAR or EAR controlled categories, is CUI when performing a DoD contract. Okay. And that, Anna, is right here. Just for your ease of, I'll move this over here. I don't know if you guys can actually see my, see the chat box, but this is what they, of course it doesn't have this fancy graphic, but it's just in written form. But this is what the answer in part that it provides you. Eric Johnson, what about package drawings for the product? Yes, such as a cloth bag to supply a product in. Now, Eric, this is you know, the DoD does not mince about the details. So let me give you a real world example. So there was a specification for a case that a particular missile came in. Okay. For a infantry-based weapon system. And the people are like, look, it's a plastic box and it's a foam interior. Is the specification for the box, is that CUI? And the answer is that the DoD instruction 5230.24 doesn't differentiate whether it's a plastic box with a foam insert. Okay. What it says is the technical information unique and relative to the performance of the military and space function or the military and space application? And the answer may be, Eric, as silly as it may sound, that the cloth bag that the product comes in may very well be, if that's a unique specification that's uniquely designed for the delivery of that product. Right. Now, if it could be any cloth bag, and it's a generic commercial specification, well, then the answer is probably no. Right. But if it's a unique technical specification or perhaps a unique material, maybe a flame retardant or fire retardant material, then it's, again, a unique specification configured with a unique specification within its configuration and within its design, or maybe in its stitching, right? Or the drawstring. I mean, as silly as these things sound, if it's unique to the DoD purpose, and it's not commercially available, then the answer could be yes. So Jan Bergen says, would an invoice done for the DoD Prime for a deliverable on an engineering contract be considered CUI then also? Well, so Jan, yeah. So that financial information is only information relative. If you look in I know it may be confusing, but if you look down in the definition and look in the authorities, this is where you really need to parse the details here. You will see that that information, as described in there, is for the actual RFP process and not for the transactional process relative to the contract performance itself. Okay, it's before the contract award, and the DoD wants to protect your financial information that's supplied to them before the award to the contract so you don't get exploited during that process. So if you're providing an invoice and the invoice doesn't contain any technical information and it's just transactional information that has no expectation of confidentiality, then it is not certainly not CUI and it's not federal contract information. However, if in the details of that PO you put the specifications of the technical specifications that would qualify CUI, then you end up accidentally or purposefully making that purchase order CUI. What my recommendation to you is that you add a secure attachment and reference the secure attachment sent a different way, okay, or available a different way, and you reference that attachment in the PO itself. So you say see reference number or document number 12345 6 for the technical specifications relative to the performance of the work, something like that, right? Or see document 12345 6 for the schedule and delivery relative to the performance of the work. That could constitute as controlled technical information. So that information you would be removed and be referenced in the PO, but removed into a different attachment. And that's how you fix that. Okay, Abdullah, which I appreciate your attendance as always to our webinars. Yeah, thank you, Abdullah. I appreciate that. Hey, if you're still here. So David Dempsey, your focus is understandably on technical data. That's true. Nevertheless, it appears virtually everything is CUI. Yes. Everything is described within the DoD Instruction 5230.24 as it is described in DoD Instruction 5230.24 is controlled technical information. Okay. Labor hours and cost and data are not CUI. So when we put that data together for proposals, okay, that data is CUI when it's submitted to the government. It is not CUI prior to the contract award. You might ask, well, why is that? Why is that so? Well, the reason it's so is because the contract award is what enforces the requirements. Okay, the 32 CFR Part 2002 prevents the DoD from leveraging their requirements on you without a contract or without an award. If there is no agreement in place, they can only be highly recommended according to the 32 CFR Part 2002. So when we have proposal data or labor hours or cost data that is proprietary information that you want protected as CUI when you submit it to the government, underneath the definition of CUI, it is protected when it is received by the DoD as CUI. And if they reject your proposal and send it back to you, it is not CUI after that. They've sent you back your proposal and it is your proprietary information. Okay. So that's an important distinction. Remember, before the award, the requirements can't be enforced. After the award, could the information that you submitted in the RFP process, if it contained technical data, could that be CUI then? The answer is yes. It is CUI if it qualifies for CUI after the award of the contract. Does that help, David? Oh, yeah, if you're still there, you're welcome, man. Of course, you're very welcome. It's my pleasure. Okay, Michael Dardis, if you're still there, David, let me know if that helps. Not much. It doesn't help much. If you could explain, I'll try to elaborate. My apologies. So, Michael Dardis says, is the finished product considered CUI, and should it be handled accordingly? Yes, it is CUI because it represents in fit, form, and function. It represents the technical specification itself, and make no mistake about it, it is controlled by the DoD. You cannot repurpose an item that the DoD has purchased through you or by you that is underneath the DFAR 7012 unless it has been decontrolled, and that includes the technical information itself. So that's an important component of the knowledge that you need to have prior to engaging in this line of work. Okay, thank you, Michael. I hope that was helpful. Okay, David, this is your last chance, David Dempsey. And if you're welcome to reach out to me at Regan Edens at dtcglobal.us or connect with me on LinkedIn and we can have that conversation. I'm happy to try to amplify or elaborate or clarify my comments so it can help you understand. So it's a wonderful privilege and honor to spend this time with you. I know it's a long 2 hours and a lot of technical detail, and I am genuinely appreciative of your time and your attention, as I consider that extremely valuable as my own. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to equip and enable you to be successful. Okay, not to enslave you or not to burden you with things that you don't need to do. Everything that I told you is consistent and accurate with the DoD requirements. If you do what I tell you and follow the examples that are provided in DoD's policy and the guidance provided by DoD, you will succeed. We will protect this information, because together we must secure America's defense supply chain. So thank you very much. And I am very grateful for your time, and I bid you adieu. And Selena, I'll try to answer your question after we end the broadcast. So thank you very much, everyone.